Hi there. It's very exciting to be here today. So I'm going to talk to you about why we should be taking comics more seriously. As my introduction just mentioned, I am a comic creator, which means that I write and draw graphic novels, comic strips like you find in newspapers. I even do like comic articles and even make comic sculptures and digital comics. So as you can tell, I'm a bit of a comic fanatic. And what I'm going to do today is do a talk using the medium of comics that will attempt to reset your mind and awaken you to the power and potential of one of the most exciting mediums around. Or rather, I'm going to attempt to convert you to the dork side. So I'm going to take a look at 3 aspects of the power of comics and then show you how I used it finally as a force for good in a graphic story I did in collaboration with the British Red Cross and an amazingly inspiring 15-year-old Iranian refugee called Ebrahim. So the first aspect of the power of comics for me is that everyone can draw comics and create worlds. As children, I think we all inherently understand the power of the mighty pen. When I was a child, I would sit on the floor, like I'm sure many of you have, surrounded by toys and pens and papers, and I would draw stories and imagine worlds. I'd imagine myself as a megalomaniac madwoman who could create and destroy entire armies of characters and whole kingdoms inside my head. There's something incredibly important about telling stories and pictures, about organizing our messy and complicated lives into panels and frames and scenes and displaying them sequentially across the page to kind of make sense and create our own narratives. Much like the cavemen used to take moments of their time and display them sequentially across the cave wall. Visual stories and comics are incredibly accessible. There's no barriers to entry. Anybody can create their own. All you need is a pen and paper. It's not like with film or photography, which is quite expensive. And I think that it's this kind of primitive and primal nature of visual storytelling which has caused some people to mistake comics as a kind of childlike medium. So secondly, comics allow you to see other people's worlds. I fell in love with my first graphic novel about 15 years ago, and I ventured to my very first comic convention in a church hall in London. And I don't know if any of you have ever been to a comic convention, but you really have to go. The most exciting place. Comic creators sit behind tables laden with their own graphic stories, and it's as if each one of them is a kind of unadulterated worldview of that particular artist. And as you pick up their comics and leaf through them, it's as if you're picking up a pair of goggles allowing you to see the world through different artists' eyes. From M.K. Serwick, a comic nurse who drew an oral history graphic story about her experiences working on an HIV ward during the outbreak in the 80s in America, to Nicholas Streeton, who wrote an amazing graphic novel about the loss of her 2-year-old son, or Jumana Medlej, who grew up in war-torn Lebanon and created a female superhero who could bring peace to her country. One of the joys of the comic medium is that there's very few words and often, sometimes, no words at all. So it allows comics to be translated in a way which is kind of still what the artist intended. I've read that only 2.5% of traditional text-based books in the UK are actually translated, which really saddens me as it's as if we're closing our eyes off to a world of different viewpoints. But for graphic novels, I've read a huge amount of international comics because they're so accessible. I've read comics from Colombia, Argentina, South Africa, from Bangladesh, Korea, and of course from Japan, as there's a huge rise in the popularity of manga, which is bringing a whole different culture over to the West. Thirdly, comics communicate with the world. Several years ago, I was lucky enough to be involved with an amazing project, which was part of the Komissia Festival in Russia. I was invited alongside several different comic artists from all over Europe, from Turkey, Finland, Germany, and the Ukraine, Russia, of course. And we all would excitedly converse during mealtimes, using the help of an incredibly patient translator. However, when the translator's meal arrived, all the chattering comic artists fell into silence, until slowly, the sound of knives and forks scratching on plates was replaced with the sound of pens scratching on pads, as we began to communicate with each other using the medium of comics. It was an incredibly exciting and magical moment, as if we'd gone back to before the Tower of Babel. Not only do comics surpass boundaries of linguistics and global boundaries, but they also can cross boundaries created by class, education, and even age. I've witnessed this myself as I run workshops from people from all different walks of life, from university academics to homeless adults, vulnerable youth, and art students and families from all over the world. And it's so exciting to witness these vast array of people picking up the same comics, getting excited by the same ideas, and then picking up their own pens and drawing their own worldviews. The power of comics to reach a mass audience is even apparent to the CIA, who created 2 propaganda comics, the first distributed in Vietnam in the 60s, and the second in Grenada in the 80s. Repeatedly, even Colonel Gaddafi created a propaganda biography, so it's quite interesting to see. Since the 18th century, comics have harnessed the power of the printed press to bring visual stories out from elitist galleries like those of William Hogarth and to the masses who can own them and distribute them very cheaply. And today that move continues as comics very easily go from beautiful, physical, printed books to online, interactive, and visual narratives. While comics are finding this movement very easily, there are more traditional text-based books which are struggling to move from paper to iPads, Kindles, and websites. So to summarize, the 3 powers of comics is that, firstly, everyone can draw comics and create worlds. There's no barriers to entry. Secondly, comics allow you to see other people's worlds. And thirdly, comics communicate with the world. But my powers as a comic artist were about to be put to the test in one of the most difficult comics I had ever drawn. I received a phone call from Rosie Stewart at the British Red Cross back in February. And the British Red Cross wanted to tell the story of one single individual refugee, young refugee, under the age of 18. And this refugee was one of the 1,000 refugees under the age of 18 who arrive in the UK every year completely alone. This is a small percentage of the 10,000 refugees arriving in the UK each year. And this may sound as if the UK is opening the floodgates to refugees. However, that is not the case, as the UK hosts less than 1% of the world's refugees, which is shockingly low. So where did this assumption come from? Well, the mainstream media and the newspapers are often quite harsh in their representations of refugees, and they very rarely give a voice to the refugees themselves. So the British Red Cross wanted to try and use comics to tell a new kind of story and reach a new kind of audience. And that's how I found myself in April sitting in the offices of the British Red Cross on a very grey day, across from a remarkable and incredible refugee called Ebrahim from Iran. I was, to be honest, fairly weary and nervous about meeting Ebrahim. I'd done a lot of comic journalism before, but Ebrahim was, this was an incredible story he was offering up to us, and an incredibly personal and traumatic story. And I was aware of the negative press surrounding refugees and wanted to do his story justice. And Ebrahim was also incredibly wary, because in fact he'd shared this story more than 30 times with asylum agencies and the Home Office, having to repeat the trauma of his story again and again, and turning the rich colors and vivid emotions of his Odyssey-like journey into facts, bureaucratic tick boxes, and evidence in courts of law. I listened to his incredible story about his journey from fleeing violence at his home in Iran, being human trafficked across the world, and finally arriving in the UK where he thought he'd found safety, but then being forced to undergo 4 years of an incredibly grueling asylum process, with constantly the threat of being deported hanging over him. And I had tears in my eyes hearing the details of his story. It was incredibly moving. But far from feeling pity from him, I thought he was one of the most remarkable young teenagers I'd ever met. And I felt honored that the UK had been able to provide him with a safe and secure home. So for the weeks that followed, we battled to do his story justice, and I really felt the pressure of getting this story right. We went back and forth between the British Red Cross and Ebrahim and myself, and slowly, bit by bit, this story began to emerge, until we finally finished our graphic story over under Sideways Down. Together we created a new kind of narrative. We turned victims into heroes and rewritten a story which we were all so tired of hearing. And Ebrahim was able to show his view of the world and share that with a mass audience. And he was able to reclaim his story as his own again. I don't have time to read you from the story today, but you can read it at webapps.redcross.org.uk/Refugee Week comic /, or you can simply Google Over Under Sideways Down comic and read it online. There are also copies available outside today for you to take home. After we'd finished, the comic started its own journey. It was shown in workshops run by the British Red Cross, and refugees who were not Ebrahim came forward and said, "This is my story." It was picked up on social media and tweeted about by the likes of Neil Gaiman, Simon Pegg, Caroline Lucas, and written about in newspapers from The Guardian to the Daily Express. It was even spotted being read by Home Office delegates on a plane following a conference, so we're all delighted that it's reaching the right hands. The British Red Cross gave comics a chance and saw how they were able to create a new story and spread their story to a new audience. And it's my hope that more people will start to take the medium of comics more seriously. It's also my hope that those of you in the audience today and listening online will create your own stories and be aware of the narratives which you see in the mainstream media and on TV and in newspapers. And that you'll start telling your own stories and those of the voiceless and start harnessing the power of the mighty pen. Thank you.